Hi, Mrs. Wysoon. This is Wesley, and I'll be showing my Criminal Minds presentation over the cases that Frankenstein's monster has committed. Overall, throughout this video, there are 3 crime scenes that I will be profiling and breaking down, as well as the suspect Frankenstein's monster. I hope you enjoy the video. To start things off, we have the profiling of Frankenstein's monster, the alleged suspect of all 3 of these crime scenes. The monster is rather physically posing, standing around 8 feet tall to be exact, and enormous strength. He's pretty gross looking, with yellow skin that barely covers his muscles, and he has pretty vivid veins beneath. He has black lips, watery eyes, and a patchwork-like, skin to contribute to his terrifying look. Despite all of this, he moves with surprising agility and grace for his size. Now for the way he carries himself and the way he dresses. The monster most likely carries himself with a mix of really high self-awareness and defensiveness due to the constant rejection that he faces. He dresses in whatever clothing he can find, which is often a little ragged and ill-fitting, and he is not integrated into society and has no consistent means of acquiring proper attire. Now, time for his speech style. Regardless of how he looks, which is pretty monstrous, he speaks very articulately and elevated with a philosophical tone. His language is often poetic and reflects the book that he read, Milton's Paradise Lost, and his longing for understanding and companionship. There is some identifiable patterns. The modern speech is marked by emotional depth and intelligence, especially when he talks to Victor about his emotional longing for a companion. But it's also filled with bitterness, resentment, and sorrow. His voice is rather powerful though, and he's usually often pleading for sympathy or, later in the story, revenge. Now for his birthplace and upbringing. The monster was born in the laboratory and assembled from the parts of various corpses by Victor Frankenstein. Unlike a human child, he had no parents, no nurturing, no environment, and no socialization. He was pretty much abandoned from the start. And he was left alone to learn about the world and picking up knowledge from observing others and reading books. Now for his upbringing and isolation. From the moment that he was created, the monster was left to fend for himself without guidance or companionship. His upbringing was one harsh survival, and he was rejected by all who saw him due to his crazy-looking appearance. Now for the time period. The monster exists in the early 19th century, which was an era for scientific discovery and Enlightenment thinking. However, this time period also lacked the psychological and emotional support systems that might have helped him cope with his isolation. Now for the impact of the times. The monster's thinking is deeply shaped by the literature of the time, since he was pretty much only observant of the books which he read and from looking at the family which he observed for a while. So the books were kind of like Paradise Lost, which feed his ideas about humanity and God and his own status as an outcast. The lack of understanding and fear surrounding his creepy and gross look reflects the period's limited approach to mental and emotional well-being. Now for his main motivation. Now here's a little reminder about Frankenstein's monster, not Frankenstein. The monster's primary motivation was pretty much for a desire for companionship. His primary motivation is the need for acceptance and companionship. He seeks love and understanding, but is constantly denied by society and most painfully by his own creator. His loneliness and desire for connection drive much of his tragic arc. Now for his revenge, in which he murdered 3 people. After repeated rejection and mistreatment from pretty much society as a whole, along with his creator, his motivations shift toward vengeance, particularly against his creator, Victor Frankenstein, who he believes caused all his suffering in bringing him into existence and abandoning him. Here are some redeeming qualities about the monster. The monster is pretty smart, and he's curious and capable of profound thought and emotion. He's self-aware, capable of love, and initially seeks peace. He is not born evil, but shaped by the cruelty he experienced from society and his creator. He does have a capacity for good. Early in his life, the monster shows a capacity for kindness. helping people like the DeLacy family, even though he receives nothing but scorn and in return. His initial desire is not for violence, but for understanding and companionship. Another additional example might be whenever he saved a girl out of the water, to which he received a shot in his right shoulder for. Now for some personality flaws. He has a bit of bitterness and vengeance within him. The monster's deep loneliness and constant rejection foster his bitterness, which leads him to pursue revenge against Victor and humanity. His emotional pain turns into hatred, which drives him to commit violent acts. He also has impulsivity from trauma. Now remember, his mind is that of a child, and his maturity is that of a child. So he has a bit of impulse in his actions from his trauma. The trauma of being rejected by everyone, including his creator, causes the monster to lash out, and this impulsiveness leads him to commit murder, most notably the deaths of William Frankenstein and others close to Victor, like Elizabeth and Henry Clerval. Those three are the three crime scenes that we'll be dissecting later on after this profile. His lack in control over emotions, especially anger, is a key flaw. Now, he does have an object of sentimental value: books and literature. The monster holds dear to the books that he finds, such as Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, and The Sorrows of Young Werther. These works are his only connection to human thought, teaching him language, morality, and a sense of identity. However, they also fuel his tragic understanding of his place in the world as an outcast, deepening his misery. Now for a couple of secrets. These are things no one knows about except for pretty much Victor, and that's pretty much it. Number 1, his loneliness. The monster's greatest secret is the depth of loneliness and sorrow. Despite his violent actions, he harbors a profound yearning to be accepted and loved, feelings that remain hidden beneath his monstrous exterior. He hides vulnerability beneath layers of anger and bitterness. Now, the desire for redemption. Even as he commits terrible acts, the monster secretly hopes for redemption or at least an end to his suffering. His plea to Victor to create a companion him, a Mrs. Frankenstein. Oh! That was habit, I apologize. Is pleased to create a companion for him, a Mrs. Monster, would you say, reveals his desires for a chance at peace, but this is pretty much thrown away as soon as Victor destroys the female creature. Now for his contemporary counterpart, Ed Gein. Time for the similarities between the two. Both Ed Gein and the monster experienced severe social isolation. The monster was abandoned by his creator and rejected by society, while Gein grew up in a highly secluded environment with an overbearing, abusive mother. Now, that is a difference between the two. Ed Gein grew up with a very overbearing, abusive mother, while Frankenstein pretty much grew up by himself, secluded. His creator, or mother, or father, you should say, pretty much abandoned him from the start. So yes, they both have terrible parents, but that is not one of my differences that I pretty much state. It's just something that I observed. Now for a second great comparison between the two, Ed Gein and Frankenstein both were shaped by the environment. The monster's actions are driven by rejection and cruelty from those around him, and Gein's violent tendencies are largely influenced by his dysfunctional upbringing and oppressive family dynamics. Now for the comparison for the acts of violence. Both figures, though for different reasons, ended up committing acts of violence, with Frankenstein's monster turning to murder out of frustration and revenge, and Gein committing gruesome crimes influenced by his psychological disturbances. Now, time for the contrast between Ed Gein and Frankenstein's monster. They had a couple of differences, so here they are. The number 1 is the motive for violence. Frankenstein's monster acts out of desire for justice and revenge after being wrong, whereas Ed Gein's crimes seem to be driven by deep psychological illness. Now for their overall nature. The monster is portrayed as pretty much inherently kind and intelligent, but corrupted by mistreatment, while Gein, though potentially shaped by his environment, exhibited deeply ingrained and disturbing tendencies rooted in psychosis. Now for the difference between murder and serial killer. So, murder was the fact that Ed Gein only killed one person, and Frankenstein's monster only killed 3 people. Now for the profiling of the actual crime scenes. The first person I would like to talk about is William Frankenstein. William Frankenstein was around 7 years old, and the relation to the suspect was that he was the younger brother of Victor Frankenstein, which was the creator of the monster. Now time for the scene description. The victim was found in a secluded area near Geneva and woods outside the family estate. The setting was isolated, quiet, and surrounded by trees, a place where a child might have wandered incorrectly, unaware of the lurking danger. Frankenstein's monster. Now for a behavioral analysis of the crime scene. Victim profile. William was an innocent young kid who pretty much represents purity and love, so that means he couldn't be killed for anything that he had done wrong, but rather as a result of a symbolic connection to Victor Frankenstein. His youth and vulnerability made him an easy target, and he likely did not understand the threat that he faced. It must have been a sad death. I wonder how that really went down. Like just Frankenstein's monsters going, oh, oh. Now for some crime scene details. The scene suggests a crime of opportunity with no clear signs of prolonged struggle. William likely encountered his attacker unexpectedly. Given the monster's pretty big strength and size, the child would have been overwhelmed really quickly and killed pretty quickly. The killer's method? I'm not Australian. The killer's method, strangulation, pretty much shows that the attacker was personally involved in the killing, like up and close. So, because strangulation, you need to be like up next to the person you're strangling. Now for a post-mortem examination. So William's neck had bruises from the strangulation, and that pretty much means that this was driven by rage or frustration. There was an opportunity to use a weapon, but he wanted to strangle her, which means like he wanted control over everything. He also wanted to inflict suffering directly. It was not a detached or personal killing, it was personal. Now for a closing statement on this case. The murder of William Frankenstein is not just a random act of violence. It is deeply personal, fueled by the monster's anger towards his creator, Victor Frankenstein. The brutality and directness of the attack, combined with careful framing of Justine Morowitz, just pretty much shows a calculated escalation in the monster's behavior. Now time for the second act of violence done by the monster on Henry Clerval. Henry Clerval was around his mid-20s, and he was related to Victor Frankenstein as a closest friend since childhood. He was a cheerful, compassionate, and intelligent man. Clerval represented the human connection and moral goodness that Victor had distanced himself from. His death marks another tragic loss for Victor, alongside William, and the destruction of someone innocent in the monster's vengeful rampage. Now for a scene description of the crime. The location. Henry's body was found in a remote area of the shores of Ireland, where he had accompanied Victor on a scientific expedition. The crime scene had no vegetation and it was pretty desolate. The eerie, empty surroundings highlight the brutality of the crime. Henry was left in place where no one could have intervened. Now for the crime scene details. The body was discovered with clear signs of violence, strangulation, just like William. Henry's face was described as contorted in an expression of pain and terror, indicating that his breath was neither quick nor merciful. The monster, driven by deep anger and a desire for revenge, likely used overwhelming physical force to subdue and kill Henry. Now for a behavioral analysis of the crime scene. A victim profile. Henry Clerval was a kind and upbeat guy, intelligent and also optimistic. He was driven by a desire to explore the world and better himself through knowledge. His upbeat and compassionate nature made him the moral counterpoint to Victor's increasingly dark, isolated existence. They are pretty much just meant for each other in the terms of best friends. Unlike Victor, who became consumed by scientific ambition, Henry remained grounded, motivated by his love for literature, nature, and human connection. His innocence and goodness made him a tragic victim. He was killed not for anything he had done, but because of his relationship for Victor. Now for a crime scene analysis. The crime scene shows clear signs of personal violence. Strangulation, like I've said again, indicates close physical contact and suggests a high level of emotional involvement. This wasn't an impersonal or detached murder. Just like William, this was a very personal and up-close, emotionally connected murder. The killer wanted to see Henry's life leave his body, a sign of the monster's growing rage and a desperation. Henry's body was left in a place where it could be easily found, suggesting that the monster was unconcerned with hiding his crime. Instead, the murder seems to be a direct message to Victor, meant to inflict maximum emotional damage. Now for my closing statement. Henry Clerval's murder is another calculated move by the monster to destroy everything that Victor Frankenstein loves. The personal and intimate method of killing, combined with the deliberate choice of victim, shows the monster's growing sophistication in showing revenge. Henry, as Victor's closest friend and moral counterpart, was the perfect target for the monster's wrath. His murder leaves Victor more isolated and broken than ever, a reflection of the monster's own feelings of abandonment and pain. The monster has now fully embraced his role as a vengeful force, methodically dismantling Victor's life piece by piece. As he continues to experience rejection, this suspect is more likely to evolve into a further methodical killer, which is seeking to pretty much dismantle and make Victor very emotionally and mentally distraught. Lastly, for the criminal explanation for Elizabeth Lavenza, the final act of murder done by Frankenstein's monster. Elizabeth Lavenza was around her mid-20s, and she was deeply beloved by Victor Frankenstein because he was her fiancé. Now, the way she was related to him was because Victor Frankenstein created Frankenstein's monster. Now for the scene description. The murder occurred on the couple's wedding night in a secluded bedroom at an inn in Italy. The room was elegantly decorated for their wedding night, a scene meant for celebration but tragically turned into a horrific crime scene. The room was found with Elizabeth's lifeless body, the aftermath of a brutal killing. Now for a behavioral analysis of the crime scene. The first thing, the victim profile. Elizabeth was pretty much an ultimate symbol of innocence, love, and purity, having been Victor's companion since childhood. Now, just to remember, she was super vulnerable in the situation, considering the fact that she was completely unaware of the danger that was in her presence. Now for the crime scene details. Elizabeth, akin to William, was killed by strangulation. This suggests personal involvement as well, requiring close physical contact and an extended emotional investment. The fact that Elizabeth was murdered on her wedding night, a time she would have felt safe and loved, heightens the tragedy and the calculated cruelty of the attack. It was also a promise because Victor Frankenstein killed Frankenstein's monster's only companion that he made. Now for the post-mortem explanation. The signs of strangulation on her body suggest extreme force, much like the other victims of the monster, like William, that we've covered so far. The presence of no significant struggle suggests she was caught off guard, possibly while resting or relaxing, likely in her wedding attire. The crime was swift and efficient, driven by the monster's need for revenge, not sadistic pleasure. Now for a little closing statement on this murder. Elizabeth's murder is the monster's final calculated act of revenge against Victor Frankenstein. It represents a culmination of the monster's emotional transformation from being one who sought love and acceptance to one who now seeks only to destroy. The symbolism of murdering Victor's bride on the wedding night, combined with intimate method of strangulation, makes the crime the ultimate expression of the monster's need to inflict suffering. It marks a point of no return, leaving both Victor and the monster trapped in a cycle of devastation and loss. That sums up my profiling of the killer, Frankenstein's monster. Be careful, you never know if someone's still trying to create him.